Hello and welcome to the module on building your course. In this session we're going to look at some basic course design principles that will help you to lay out and design your course from start to finish. Now these principles do translate to both face-to-face classrooms as well as online courses. Basically, good design is good design. Even if your course has already been designed for you, you'll find some value in the activities we're going to do during this session. It'll help you to find out if you have any gaps or areas that are missing in your course, as well as point out any areas where we might have extra activities or materials that are not necessary. So let's take a look at today's objectives. Okay, so in this session we're going to have 4 objectives. By the end, we should be able to identify the Bloom's taxonomy verbs that we use for writing objectives. We should be able to discuss best practices for writing course and lesson objectives, as well as identifying the steps of backwards design for structuring a course or specific lesson. And in the end, you'll be able to design your own course structure, outline, or concept map using the techniques introduced in this session. Okay, so here's how we're going to meet our objectives. This module is going to be organized into 2 main sections. In section 1, we're going to look at learning objectives. What are they, and what is Bloom's taxonomy and the action verbs that are used to write objectives? And then we're going to look at the best practices for writing objectives. Then in section 2, we're going to look at backwards design and mapping your course. We'll start by looking at the steps of the backwards design model, and then looking at the idea of using concept mapping to design your course. And we will wrap everything with a final activity that you're going to do to prove your mastery in this topic. Section 1, Learning Objectives. So what are objectives? A well-designed course should have learning objectives at multiple levels. We are likely well aware that we need to have overall course objectives for each of our courses, just as we are likely aware of any departmental learning objectives that may need to be considered during course design. And if you're working with a course that was designed for you or that someone else has taught before, these objectives may have already been decided, leaving you only to work within the goals decided for you. But we also need to have learning objectives for each individual unit of learning. Now this might mean individual learning objectives for each class period or for each module or week of learning online. These more specific learning objectives not only tie back and support our overall course objectives, they also guide us through deciding what content should be included and which learning activities would best support the learning goals. This section will introduce the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, the action verbs, and some best practices for writing learning objectives at every level. So, even if your course already has objectives written, you may find this lesson and corresponding activities to be valuable for helping you to see any gaps, excess materials or activities, or even areas in which the course does not align with the written course objectives. So, moving on. Let's look at what makes a good objective. There are a few guidelines you should follow when writing learning objectives. A well-written objective should be actionable, observable, and if at all possible, measurable. We should be careful not to create too many or create redundancies. We want to make sure we are stating our learning goals in the most clear and concise way. The reason that this is important is we don't want to overload our course with more goals than possible to reach in the allotted time we have, or muddy the water, making it hard to see what our most important goals are. And the final guideline would be to utilize Bloom's taxonomy's levels of learning and coordinating action verbs. Here you see an example of a Bloom's taxonomy diagram. At the bottom of the pyramid, we see the level of learning called remembering, recalling relevant knowledge from long-term memory. Up a level from that, we see understanding, making sense of the material you have learned. A level up from that, we hit applying, using the knowledge gained in new ways. After that, we should be able to analyze, breaking that concept into parts and understanding how each part is related to one another. moving up to evaluating, making judgments based on a set of guidelines, and finally hitting the point of creation, putting information together in an innovative way. Now, there is some debate about how this diagram should be laid out. Maybe it's not a pyramid, but instead a circle. Maybe it's not linear at all. But regardless of what the diagram looks like, the idea you should take from this is that our students' experiences in class should build upon themselves. Our students should be taking what they memorize and make sense of it, apply it into perspective that makes sense to them and the world around them, break the information into parts and understand how the pieces relate to each other, make personal judgments based on what they have learned, and ultimately create for themselves. Now, we might not get the whole pyramid in class, not in one class period or one class overall, but they should move through these stages over the period of learning as a whole. So, we want to make sure that our course and lesson objectives allow our students opportunities to build on what they are learning and ultimately get to higher order thinking. Okay, we will be wrapping up section 1 of this module by doing a couple of activities, one of which is going to be a worksheet that you're going to complete about writing objectives, and also in the module you're going to be asked to complete a 3-question quiz. So looking at the worksheet first. If you were to pause this video and then return back to D2L and look into the module, you'll see under module contents a couple of things. First, you'll see the Blooms for Course Objectives worksheet. You're going to want to print that out. Also provided to you are 2 sheets that have lists of Bloom's taxonomy verbs. There's a regular version of it, and then there's a version for digital. You might want to print both of those out or have them up on your screen to reference. So once you have your worksheet printed out and your verbs up and ready to look at, we're going to return to the rules we looked at before about writing good objectives. We want to remember that we want to try to make them actionable, observable, and measurable if possible. We want to limit how many we have. We want to have only as many as we need. And then we want to utilize Bloom's taxonomy and the action verbs to write them. Now, looking specifically at the worksheet, here is an example of one that we got started for you. In the far left column, you're going to write down your overall goal or objective without too much concern on how it's written. Basically, write down what your goal is. Now, if you have a course that already has its overall course objectives written and you don't really want to mess with those, you can choose to select a module or section of learning and work specifically on those objectives. So, take whatever section you've decided to work on and write in the left column the basic overall gist of what your course goals or lesson objectives are. So we're not worrying too much about how they're written there. Then we're going to move to the middle column. In the middle column under Bloom's level of verbs, you're going to first determine what level of Bloom's you believe this activity or goal or objective lies in, and pick out a verb from the corresponding list that best works with what goal you have. So in this instance, understanding basic biology terms is clearly sitting in the remembering, so at the bottom of the pyramid, and I chose the word identify. And then in the far right column, we're going to rewrite our objective using Bloom's taxonomy and our rules. So my objective came identify basic biology terms. It went from understand basic biology terms to identify basic biology terms. Okay, so I'm going to put the rules back up on the screen so that you can pause the video and have them there to reference. And then if you have your verbs printed out in your worksheet, you can complete the worksheet at your leisure. This is the end of section 1 once you've done that. And don't forget that once you're done with this activity, you want to go back out to the D2L module, find the quiz, and complete that as well. Once you've done both of these activities and you're ready to move on, you'll find the section 2 video just a little bit further down in the module content.